The bye week is come and gone for the USC Trojans as they get set to rejoin Pac-12 play this coming weekend with Arizona. We got Matt Zemek on the line, of course, for our weekly Trojans edition of the Voice of College Football on our USC channel. We appreciate everybody being here. Leave those comments and questions there in the live chat for the next 60 minutes. We will be here with Matt talking Trojans, the Pac-12, and the college football landscape as it pertains to USC. Matt, how you doing tonight?
I'm Matt Zemek, and I was wrong about Bo Nix. That's my opening statement. There's no other way to say it. You got to own up when you're wrong. Take the L, eat it, own it. I'm owning it. I was wrong about Bo Nix. So for Oregon fans listening in here at the Voice of College Football, hey, I was wrong.
Matt, at least you took a stand. I would be tempted, slightly tempted, to point right back at you and say I was right about Bo Nix, but was I truly right about Bo Nix? No, I was conditionally right. I've kind of played the middle on that. I was
you told me to pump the brakes on it. You told me to pump the brakes on it, and I didn't listen to Mark Rogers. That's what happens when I don't listen to Mark Rogers here at the Voice of College Football.
Not at all. Again, Matt took a stand. I was a little bit more of a conditional. Bo Nix can be good. He can be bad. He's obviously fitting in quite well with Oregon, and quite a display they put on at Autzen Stadium on the offensive side of the ball, in particular against UCLA in the key game this past weekend. USC gets back at it against Arizona. So, Matt, let's start with that in regards to the USC landscape and what we saw in the Pac-12 this past weekend and how it pertains to USC's stretch drive.
Well, there's an interesting little drama here on Twitter and in terms of the discussions of a three-way tiebreaker, especially one that involves specifically USC, Utah, and Oregon. Now, that would happen if USC beats UCLA and Utah beats Oregon. That would create a three-way tie, assuming those teams win the other games. All right. Now, the Pac-12 tiebreaker language does say if all the teams play each other, head-to-head is first. So technically, because USC and Oregon don't play each other, you could interpret that as saying all the teams do not play each other, which means head-to-head gets invalidated. But if Utah beats Oregon, it will have head-to-heads over USC and Oregon. Now, I'm interpreting that as meaning that if there's a three-way tie and one team has head-to-heads over the other two, that meets the criteria of, all the teams played each other relative to Utah and the three-team tie. Like the Pac-12 could not allow Utah to be eliminated in a three-way tie when it has head-to-heads over both USC and Oregon. But the language is not 100% airtight on that. So that's a little controversy there. Some USC fans have told me USC controls its own destiny because head-to-heads don't apply. But I'm of the view that, wait, you can't keep Utah out when it has head-to-head wins over Oregon and USC if we get to that scenario. But maybe the Pac-12 really is going to, put egg on its face. So there is ambiguity. Like, there is ambiguity in the language. I don't think the Pac-12's writing of the tiebreaker procedures closed that loophole fully. So that's why it's fair to interpret this as, head-to-heads don't apply because all three aren't playing. But my interpretation is, if Utah wasn't playing Oregon and it was and so Utah, no team had head-to-head wins over the other two, that's when the next tiebreaker applies. But I'm thinking that if one team has head-to-heads over the other two in a three-way, it doesn't matter that USC and Oregon didn't play. I don't think that's going to invalidate Utah's head-to-heads. But I will grant the USC fans that are saying USC controls its own destiny, I will grant there is some ambiguity there. But like, that would just be the ultimate egg on your face moment for the Pac-12 if it really did allow that loophole to exist. I just can't think that's really how they intended that rule to be. So it would be nice to have a formal announcement from the conference office saying, actually, yeah, because Utah has both head-to-heads, it would get the tiebreaker. All that having been said, for USC, win your games And I'm certainly feeling a lot better about USC's chances against UCLA after watching UCLA's defense get shredded like that. UCLA's defense is slow. UCLA's defense does not have the personnel to match up against a healthy USC offense. And one of the things we've been saying the past few weeks here at the Voice of College Football is that USC has this soft on-ramp to that UCLA game on November 19th. Arizona, Cal, Colorado, and Arizona, the opponent this weekend, it's clearly the biggest test of the three, partly because Cal and Colorado are not nearly as good on offense right now. And I know Cal beat Arizona by 18, but like that just seems like an anomaly because Cal could not light up Washington. If you can't light up Washington's porous secondary, you don't have a very good offense. All right. So Cal's in the dumpster right now, as is Colorado. So, like, those two games are layups for USC. Like, zero question about those. Arizona, yeah, there is a little bit of a question mark surrounding this game. I mean, USC heavily favored, but I can at least imagine a scenario in which Arizona makes this game interesting. And that scenario is pretty simple. Jayden de Laura plays great. He plays his best game of the season. Arizona is able to hit downfield strikes against a USC secondary that didn't perform very well against Utah, could not figure out Dalton Kincaid, could not stop Cam Rising in the downfield passing game. If Jayden de Laura goes nuts, maybe Arizona wins a 49-48 kind of game, but like USC is going to score a ton of points, and I think USC probably could score into the 60s if it needs to in this game. Obviously, USC a huge favorite, but there are some games where you cannot envision any scenario whatsoever in which the underdog wins. So USC Cal, USC Colorado, I count those two games as like there's no scenario in which USC loses. Arizona, yeah, there is like one scenario, maybe two, in which USC loses. It still means like USC has like a 98% chance of winning, but like Arizona has that 2% chance. So like USC coming off the idle week needs to treat this game very seriously because, and we've said this all year long here on the Voice of College Football, USC gets through this Arizona game. What happens in November? USC doesn't leave Los Angeles. All 4 November games are in Los Angeles. The UCLA game is a road game, but it's in Pasadena. So like USC gets to sleep in its own bed, don't have to board a single plane flight, really a good chance to heal and get right. And with that soft on-ramp with Cal and Colorado in early November, USC has a chance to be very healthy for that UCLA game. And so that kind of brings everything full circle. Fully healthy USC offense, fully healthy USC offensive line should be able to absolutely take a blowtorch to that UCLA defense that we saw against Oregon.
Folks, please like the video. That's a simple thing to do. Please hit the like button. It helps the YouTube algorithms. And check out Matt's work at Trojans Wire. You will see Matt's banner here in just a second. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt Zemek, and he's on Trojans Wire. To be precise, according to ESPN, USC with an 88.7% chance of winning the game in Tucson against the Wildcats, who come in at 3-4, 1-3 in the Pac-12. And Matt, are we discounting a possible 4-way tie for first place just because to thread that needle is basically impossible? So we've got, of course, the 3 teams with 1 loss, and we've got Oregon with no losses in the Pac-12. So basically, Utah would have to win the game against Oregon.
No doubt. You have to have that for have any chance of a 4-way tie. That's pretty obvious.
And then Oregon State would be the most likely team to beat Oregon otherwise. And most likely we would need UCLA to lose a game leading into USC because USC is probably not going to lose one of its games, as you just mentioned.
Well, here's the thing. You're not going to get a 4-way tie with 4 teams at 8-1. You could get a 4-way tie with teams at 7-2, but not 8-1, because now with UCLA losing, UCLA and USC both have 1 conference loss. So we're guaranteed one of them is going to lose a second conference game. So if we're going to have a 4-way tie, they all have to finish 7-2. And so the real unlikelihood there is that Oregon is going to lose twice in its remaining schedule. Very unlikely there. So the best chance for a non-2-team tiebreaker which isn't really clean and neat, is a three-way tie, most likely involving USC and then Utah and Oregon, with Utah winning at Oregon. I have to say, though, and we're going to talk about Utah in a little bit later, but once again in this UCLA Oregon game, we saw the continuing story of the Pac-12 in 2022, road teams not being able to get it done against high level opposition. Now USC came close, but that only counts in hand grenades and horseshoes, right? So no road team has been able to close the sale, and so that burden falls on Utah going to Oregon on November 19th. If you're a USC fan, and of course this is a USC show, so there's plenty of USC fans looking in here at the Voice of College Football, you have to feel pretty good about where USC sits, because you have to feel pretty good about the UCLA game and Caleb Williams and Lincoln Riley getting at that slow UCLA defense. And then you have to think that Oregon on balance is probably more likely to win that game against Utah. And so if Oregon goes 9-0 in the Pac-12 and finishes first, well, it's okay. USC can get in there at 8-1, play the Ducks in Vegas, and that's the game that really counts. So USC's path is there. And, if you ask me today, who wins Utah-Oregon on November 19th, I say I'm leaning Oregon, just because we haven't yet seen Utah play really well in a big road game. Like that is still yet to be seen this year. Cam Rising played a great game at home against USC. We have not seen the elite 2021 version of Cam Rising in big road games. Didn't see it at Florida. Didn't see it at UCLA. Committed key mistakes in that game. So the burden is on Cam Rising to really be able to keep up with Bo Nix in a possible shootout when we talk about that Oregon game a few weeks down the line on November 19th.
Man, we have often discounted the Pac-12's chances of making the college football playoff, and there were two results over the weekend, in my eyes, that really worked against the Pac-12. One was Syracuse had a double-digit lead against Clemson. The Tigers could have gone down. If you watched that game, I certainly thought that Syracuse was right there, and there were some unnecessary roughness, fouls, and late hits called against Syracuse.
USC fans can relate. USC fans can definitely relate to that.
That could have extended a drive for Syracuse and helped them out late in the game, and that was one result. And then, of course, TCU coming back from 18 down against Kansas State really could have muddied the waters in the Big 12.
Well, and, this scenario is not likely, okay, but it's in play. I mean, there is a possibility of it. It's a very tiny possibility, but just imagine, Mark, and everyone watching here on the Voice of College Football, just imagine if Garrett Riley, TCU offensive coordinator, locks Lincoln Riley out of the playoff. That would be absolutely nuts. And it's in play. Again, not likely. But if USC goes 12-1, TCU goes 13-0, that is in play. If, Clemson loses a game, or, Georgia loses a game, Alabama loses a second game, it's in play. Not likely, but it's in play. Just mind blown. That's one of those brain busters right there.
For sure. And a few people also in the comment section have latched on to something that you addressed in Trojans Wire earlier today. So check out Matt's work in Trojans Wire. The headline of the article reads, "Report: Big Ten will create a non-divisional football setup for USC's arrival in 2024. So no assignment to the Big Ten Western Division.
Yeah, so that dream appears to be dead. And Scott Docterman, a fine reporter at The Athletic, he's been covering Iowa football for years. Very good reporter. So really, really sound journalism there. He basically said that the Big Ten had some concern from its member schools about getting the football schedule in place for 2023. So the Big Ten just wanted to maintain status quo for one more year, get that settled, get it done, and then it's going to need more time to devise its precise plan for 2024. But all indications are that it's going to get rid of divisions in 2 years, when USC and UCLA join. So, you think that there's going to be like a geography-based schedule, but it's going to get rid of divisions, and it's going to go to a top 2 setup. So, in the Pac-12, that was great for USC. You didn't have to worry about beating out Utah in the Pac-12 South to get into the conference title game. But now in the Big Ten, well, that means you're going to have to finish ahead of either Ohio State or Michigan, at least one of those two, to make the Big Ten championship game. So that makes it a little bit tougher. But of course, if you're USC, you're thinking that by 2024, a couple more recruiting cycles, a couple more hits of the transfer portal, that you'll have the program at the Pete Carroll standard, ready to be at the very top of the Big Ten, and you're welcoming the challenge if you're USC. But it would have been nice. There's no denying it, to be in a Big Ten West. Even if there were going to be 1 or 2 teams shuffled out to the East and it was going to be slightly reconfigured. I know you talked about that in particular, that to get Purdue and Indiana in the same Big Ten division, even if there was a reshuffled Big Ten West, like that still set up really well for USC. So, okay, that would have been nice, but like if you're USC, you're aiming at the top anyway. So, not anything that anyone's going to lose any sleep about.
The last time we heard from Lincoln Riley coming off USC's game against Utah, there were some injuries to some impact players. Of course, Jordan Addison, Eric Gentry, Shane Lee. Do we know anything because they were listed at that point as day-to-day?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. See, important point. They've been listed as day-to-day, and that their injuries were deemed not severe, not long-term. Lincoln Riley said that, a few days after the Utah game. So they're day-to-day, but we're recording the show Monday night, and they have not been cleared to play against Arizona. So that tells you that, even if their injuries are not severe and long-term, well, they're probably not ready to play, or at least they're not 100%. And what does that mean? That means that, because it's Arizona and not a much more daunting opponent, rest them. And of course, you'll be able to rest them against Cal and Colorado for sure if there's still any lingering doubt. It's all about getting healthy for the UCLA game. I mean, one would like to think that with Mario Williams and Taj Washington and your other receivers and tight ends, that you can handle Arizona. And really, so in terms of Jordan Addison in particular, like that's not a really big concern. It's much more about the defensive side of the ball with Eric Gentry, the plays he makes, the deflections he makes in the passing game, getting into passing lanes like that. That's a much bigger absence. And of course, Gentry played against Arizona as an Arizona State Sun Devil. So, it'd be great to have him on the field in this game. But like, next man up, you need Shane Lee. You need your other players who, it's been a rough 2 weeks, I'm sure, in the film room with Alex Grinch, and getting more guys to contribute, getting more guys to, participate and perform at a higher level. Like one of the things that's worth talking about, Mark, kind of related to USC's injury situation on defense specifically, Lincoln Riley mentioned several players who he said were close to stepping up and making contributions. So like they're getting a little bit better on the practice field, but he's not ready to say like, okay, they're ready to go. They're ready to contribute for us. He said they're close. Was that a motivational ploy, or was it a true evaluation, which points to progress for those players? We don't know. I mean, obviously there's some motivation there, certainly trying to get them to arrive at a point where they are productive members of the defense. Corey Foreman was on that list. So like that was the eye grabber, and USC can really, really, really use him stepping up in this home stretch. So like if Gentry can't play against Arizona, well, okay, if Corey Foreman plays and makes an impact, all right, that's significant value. That's a significant presence. USC's linebackers are really thin right now. So if you have a pass rush that can get to Jaden Delora, that can really bother and rattle him, well, then linebackers in pass coverage becomes less of a concern. The secondary, which got roasted and toasted by Utah and Cam Rising and Dalton Kincaid, becomes less of a concern. Pass rush is the number one key to this game because, again, Jayden de Laura going off and having a great game, that's really Arizona's only path to victory. Jayden de Laura just going bonkers, that's the only way Arizona can win. This is not going to be a game where Arizona holds USC under 30. Like USC is going to score over 40. That's pretty much a lock. Arizona's given up exactly 49 points in 3 of its last 4 games. Exactly. So you think that USC can score a very high number. It's just all about, does the defense do, a reasonably good job? Doesn't have to be spectacular, but does have to do enough. And that's most likely to come from the pass rush, which, you start with Tuli Tuipulotu, but if you can get Corey Foreman as a second, third contributor with the pass rush on that defensive front, that certainly increases the margin for error and is going to make life easier for everybody on the USC defense.
Elsewhere in the Pac-12 on Saturday, Oregon travels to Cal. We talked about that. Cal Berkeley there. We've got Arizona State taking on Colorado, Stanford at UCLA. And then, of course, the Thursday night matchup that's gaining some attention. Of course, we've got Washington State hosting Utah. Cam Ward and company taking their shot at the Utes. And again, Utah has yet to impress on the road.
Yeah, we definitely talked about Utah being able to play well on the road. I mean, this is Washington State's not an elite team, but it is a spotlight game. It's going to be on national television. It's going to be under the lights. And of course, both teams, Utah and Washington State, had the past week off, before this Thursday game. You makes you wonder why the NFL can't do this, that you play a Thursday game after an off week the previous week. It's not really hard, but the NFL can't seem to figure it out. But at any rate, it is a significant game for Utah, precisely because, the Pac-12 title game and the balance of Utah's season is in play. Like, if Utah loses one more time, the season's a failure. Not making the Pac-12 title game is a failure. So, as far as Utah's concerned, this is a very big game. And so will Cam Rising play a big game on the road? So that's one plot point. And then we also have to look at the other side of the ball for the Utes. Their defense got shredded by UCLA. Their defense got shredded by USC. They couldn't handle Anthony Richardson at Florida. They will need a breakout performance against Oregon in a few weeks, but they have to be at least reasonably good against Cam Ward. And Cam Ward has not had a great season for Washington State. We don't need to pretend that he has, but what is he? He's a mobile dual threat quarterback, and that's exactly the kind of quarterback that has flummoxed Utah and defensive coordinator Morgan Scalley 3 different times: the Florida game, the USC game, the UCLA game. So, this is still a challenge for Utah's defense, because Utah didn't get any kind of pass rush against Caleb Williams and USC. If Utah doesn't get a pass rush here against what is a porous Washington State offensive line, the Cougars are weak up front, and as much as Cam Ward has to own some of the Cougars' failures this season, the biggest problem with Washington State is that offensive line. We saw Tuli Tuipulotu get 3 sacks against that Washington State offensive line on October 8th. So, we know that this offensive line has been a turnstile, and it's worth noting there are at least 3 different Washington State offensive linemen who are being switched around. I don't have their names and the exact positions, but I saw it today. There's wholesale position changes in terms of guys shifting from one position along the line to another. So Cam Ward is going to be working behind a different configuration, not necessarily different players, but players being in different spots. So that tells you that during the bye week, Jake Dickert and his offensive line coach, Clay McGuire, who, by the way, coached USC's offensive line last year, before then coming to Washington State after Clay Helton got fired. Jake Dickert and Clay McGuire, they're looking at film and saying, wow, this has not been working. We need to make large changes, not just minor tweaking around the edges. So that's an acknowledgement that this offensive line has not been working out for Washington State. So if you're Utah, hey, you need to own this offensive line. Your front 4 needs to get back to Sac Lake City, which has not really made an appearance this season. Utah needs to rediscover that identity with its fierce pass rush, getting to the quarterback, making life miserable for an opposing offense. Like, this is a game where if you're Utah's defense, you need to feast. You need to get after Cam Ward, make life hell for him, force a bunch of turnovers, and have an easy night in Pullman. But what do we know about night games in Pullman? They're not easy. They usually aren't. Just ask USC fans during the Sam Darnold years. USC played that September national TV game against Texas, the big overtime game, and then had to play at Washington State the next Friday night, and it was an ambush situation. Now, of course, Larry Scott, put USC in that position on a Friday on a short week after a big game, just total amateur hour. That's why USC fans hate Larry Scott's guts. But nevertheless, Washington State was still good enough to win that game. So, these trips to Pullman at night, they're not cakewalks for highly ranked teams. And so Utah still has to be very much on guard as it goes to the Palouse.
A few reminders, folks. We've got Discord available for you at the Voice of College Football. Go to Patreon, search MarkRogersTV, and we provide your Discord link. Join the knuckleheads there. Talk college football all the time, 24/7, 365. Get my predictions as well as a 12-pack from media members like Matt, myself, and others. So we provide, we throw 12 games at Matt and 18 other of our favorite media personalities here. They pick them straight up and against the spread. I provide more picks than that, about 20 or 25 per week. And we've had a pretty good run of throwing those up against the spread the last 3 weekends. Let's see, we're working on a 32 and 17 against the spread the last 3 weekends after a 500 start there. Also, folks, you see it down on the ticker below. Matt's podcast. It's on the College Gridiron Coast to Coast Network. Get off my pylon. What's that episode looking like at this point, Matt?
Oh, a lot of UCLA, Oregon, and a good bit on Utah, Washington State, because like those are the main courses in the Pac-12 this week. I mean, USC, Arizona, that's like a game that I'm personally interested in, but that's related to my job. But like in terms of the bigger national story, reviewing UCLA, Oregon, and previewing this Utah, Washington State Thursday night fight, and of course, on the heels of Get Off My Pylon, when you listen to that, you then also want to get over to Mark's Big Ten Paradigm, also part of the College Gridiron Coast to Coast Network.
Keep in mind, folks, 2024 is not that far away. You can get caught up on the Big Ten. All right. Herman asks, what are your thoughts on number of teams in the expanded playoffs? I am hearing 12 with buys. I prefer 8 teams. College football needs to have an equitable schedule, 9 conference, plus at least another Power 5. Okay. My thoughts on it are that it's a foregone conclusion. It's pretty well wrapped up that we're looking at a 12-team playoff in which the 4 top conference champions, as designated by the College Football Playoff Committee, will receive buys. My personal thought is that I like 12 teams for only one reason, that it provides us more college football and more resume-worthy teams to make their way into the playoffs. What I don't like about it is that we have transitioned the power of the committee from simply selecting the 4 teams to then determining the 4 teams that are conference champions that receive buys, because I think there's a huge disparity in terms of the benefit of receiving that final bye as the 4th seed versus being relegated to a 5th seed, having to play an extra game. And that's one issue I have with it, because it's not the NFL where buys can be tangibly earned based on a tie-breaking system that is fair and equitable to all. We can see it, we can measure it, but we're leaving it up to a committee to tell us who the 4 best teams in the country or the 4 best conference champions are. I don't like that. Therefore, there are too many, and we won't go into it right here, but I've just sized up in a number of videos and live streams in the past my thoughts about all the various benefits to a bye that seem very unfair to me.
Herman, without saying anything that Mark has already said, and everything Mark said is spot on. My extra thought here is, let's briefly note the group of five? Like the group of five, this is the worst group of five battle since the college football playoff era started in 2014. I mean, it's already down to just Cincinnati and Tulane. And if Cincinnati beats Tulane, and Tulane has to win out before playing Cincinnati. If Tulane doesn't win out before playing Cincinnati, we could have the nightmare scenario of like a 2-loss Tulane beating Cincinnati late in the regular season, and then you'll have a rematch between a pair of teams with 2 losses. So, like the odds of getting a 2-loss group of 5 champion are pretty high. And looking at, the rest of the Power 5 landscape, like a good team is going to be locked out of the New Year's Six while potentially a 2-loss group of 5 team gets one of those prestigious bowl bids. So that doesn't seem terribly fair, especially since Cincinnati, let's say it is Cincinnati that gets in with 2 losses, goes to the Cotton Bowl. Cincinnati lost to Arkansas. Like that was Cincinnati's big non-conference game. Cincinnati would have a nothing burger resume and yet would still get a New Year's Six bowl. So why am I mentioning that? It's because in a 12-team playoff, what if you have a 9-3 team getting one of those lower end at-large seeds? I mean, that is one of the unaddressed aspects of all this, that if you're a 9-3 team, should you be competing for a national championship? And that's why the thing that I like to bring to the table here, and why, the college football has really missed the boat on this. We don't need to have the large playoff. So like in that sense, Herman, I'm with you in terms of wanting 8 instead of 12, but I want 8 instead of 12 only if we also did have this other thing, and that is in-season flex scheduling, with one game being flex scheduled as a non-conference game in mid-November. So like you look at the first 7-8 weeks of the season, and then in late October, ESPN on preset dates in mid-November, probably 2 Saturdays instead of 1 to accommodate all the inventory. So this year would probably be November 12th and November 19th. So ESPN would make an announcement in late October, pretty much right now, saying like this non-conference team is going to play that non-conference team. And it's all TV friendly, but like you're arranging one flex scheduled matchup. If we had that every season, then you could have a smaller playoff field, right? Because you'd have all those playoff eliminators played within the regular season in mid-November. But because we don't have that, because we don't have flex scheduled games in the regular season, then you need the larger playoff. As Mark said, you need more games to determine who's better, who's worse, who deserves it, who doesn't. We don't play enough games that separate various contending teams from others within the regular season, because there are so few bites at the apple. And of course, the big powers such as Alabama, they'll play one really big non-conference game, then they'll play like a Utah State, and then they'll play a couple FCS cupcakes, or maybe like one FCS cupcake, one Sun Belt cupcake. And you really don't learn much if like Alabama's only non-conference test is Texas. Like there need to be more non-conference tests, and that's why one flex scheduled game in November, not just at the beginning of the season, but in November when the stakes are high and that the teams are good. If we had that, then we could have a very small postseason, because you'll be deciding things within the regular season. But currently, college football doesn't do that. So that's why you need the larger playoff field, because like you want to see Clemson play Michigan. You want to see TCU play Oregon. You want to see these cross-pollinated, cross-conference matchups to know who actually is better. So right now, if you have just 8 teams, you're not playing those games between or among teams like 6 through 15. You want to see those teams play before you get to your semifinals and your championship game. So in an ideal world, we would have flex scheduled regular season games and a smaller postseason, but we don't have that. So if we're not going to have flex scheduled games, you need the larger postseason field to get more games, to decide more contests objectively, not in the polls. And Mark, just as a segue to that, earlier today, I don't know if you saw this, but Heather Dinich of ESPN, she voted Ohio State #1 on the basis of, well, they're 100% in the red zone. And CJ Stroud throws a ball that NFL scouts love. Like, she actually tweeted that in a tweet saying, I'm voting Ohio State #1. Like, nothing to do with resume, nothing to do with actual achievement. Like, if you're not voting Clemson and Tennessee as the top 2 teams, maybe Georgia. If you're not voting Clemson, Tennessee, Georgia as your top 3 in some order, turn in your card. You forfeit your card as a college football voter, someone who ranks teams each week. Like, it's obvious that those are the 3 teams with the best resumes thus far. If you're voting Ohio State #1, and by the way, Dinich did not have Clemson anywhere in her top 4. Come on. We can't have this crap. But it keeps happening because people like Heather Dinich, vote for teams based on, oh, their quarterback looks like an NFL caliber quarterback, and all this other peripheral cotton candy eye test crap. It should be quality of team you beat, period. That's it. And so that's another reason why we need more teams, because when we have pollsters making decisions on rankings the way Heather Dinich does, and there are plenty of others out there like her, when you have people like her making decisions for those kinds of BS reasons, you need more teams, because teams like Clemson, not in Dinich's top 4, they're going to get shafted. So you need more teams just to cover for that kind of BS today.
Matt, you can imagine the comments that I received to my top 25 that actually make sense of a number of people that don't understand that there can be a difference between, Matt, who do you believe are the best teams in the country versus what has been earned? Exactly.
I did my Pac-12 rankings at Trojans Wire over the weekend. It's a classic case in point. Eye test. If you ask me today, USC, UCLA, November 19th, who wins? Definitely USC. Lincoln Riley, Caleb Williams running rings around that UCLA defense, which is clearly just doesn't have the personnel. UCSC is going to beat UCLA. I firmly think that. I think USC is clearly the better team than UCLA. But in terms of rankings, all right, UCLA beat Utah. USC did not. And USC doesn't have a big non-conference win. You have to rank UCLA ahead of USC in terms of rankings. So it's not about the eye test. It's not about who you think would win if they play. It's what have they done? UCLA has objectively done more than USC. That is a fact. It's not debatable. It's not negotiable. You have to rank UCLA ahead of USC right now. But you can also say when they play, USC is going to win. And that's the thing. If USC beats UCLA, USC will be ranked ahead of UCLA at the end of the season when it really matters. But in terms of handling the job of ranking teams every week in the present moment, you have to make certain decisions. You cannot rank USC higher than UCLA because UCLA and USC both played Utah and there were different outcomes there. And USC does not have a huge poker chip style win over Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia to counterbalance that. So there is zero debate. Okay. And we need to get this thing straight when we rank teams. I think USC is going to beat UCLA, but you cannot rank USC ahead of UCLA right now based on what the two teams have done. That's how you're supposed to do rankings.
Matt, we have one of our very favorites in the chat here, LBC Trojan. LBC, good to see you, of course. Rick is right there with Tony and Tim each and every USC game doing his post game. So LBC Trojan, I have Georgia #1, Tennessee 2, Clemson 3.
As anyone, you have to have those 3 teams as your top 3 in some order. So,
however,
Rick, you know what's up as usual.
Matt, are you having the same issue with that statement? We love Rick, but are you having the same issue with that statement as I am?
Well, yeah, like it doesn't really matter what happens last season. Like you don't get the special hall pass for that, but but you know, the fact that those are the top three, like that's fair. And of course, the argument to make for Georgia. Here's the argument you do make for Georgia before the Dogs have played Tennessee and Alabama, and that is that beating Oregon by 46 looks a million times better right now. That is the argument you make for Georgia. So, like, Georgia has a case based on that, but it's certainly not what the team did last year.
To me, the best win in the country, just based simply on opponent, is Tennessee over Alabama. But taking into account opponent and domination, it's Georgia over Oregon.
Absolutely. Completely agree. Nailed it.
Yeah, it's very interesting there. This is what I want to have happen some year, Matt. I want some team that went 2-10 the year before to come out of nowhere and be in the running for a college football playoff, be 9-0, 10-0, and people still be pointing back to the previous year, go, well, we can't let them in. They were 2-10 last year.
Well, TCU comes the closest to that.
Well,
and we had
5-7.
And we kind of sort of had the conversation with Syracuse and Kansas. It would be very interesting to see what the Syracuse discourse would be if the Orange had been able to hold on to that lead against Clemson.
It would be fascinating. Would love that.
Yep. But Rick, Georgia, Tennessee, Clemson as your top three, like that is a mature, responsible top three. And we can go over who should be 1, 2, 3, but like that has to be anyone's top three right now. So good job.
Matt, what has always been your thought once we, of course, went to the current system in 2014 about the AP and the coaches' polls impact, if at all, the influence on the college football playoff selection committee?
Well, I mean, those polls receive so much media attention. It's so much a part of the bloodstream of in-season and preseason media coverage. And I remember having a conversation with you several weeks ago in which you recalled the 2004 season in which Auburn was 18, 19, somewhere in there at the start of the season in the polls. Like, that's why Auburn didn't crack USC and Oklahoma. Not to say that USC and Oklahoma didn't deserve it, but like there is a direct link to the preseason poll standing and where that finished up with Auburn not being able to get into the top two. The other part of that is, the helmet. Like if it was Alabama at 19, Alabama might be able to get into the top two, but because it's Auburn, and Auburn's been jobbed in other seasons, most notably 1983, when you had Auburn sitting there beating Michigan in the Sugar Bowl, and you had Miami, who was below Auburn, heading into New Year's Day, vaulting past an Auburn team that did its job. And that Michigan team was a good team. That was a top 10. I believe Michigan was number 8. So like Auburn did its job, and yet Miami vaulted over the Tigers. Like Auburn has gotten the short straw multiple times in history. And that brings to mind the TCU situation that from 2014, TCU and Baylor, they were not Ohio State. That's why they got passed up. I mean, the Big 12 one true champion controversy, which admittedly the Big 12 did not handle very well in that instance. Nevertheless, it's because Ohio State was there as the sexy TV option and television. If you go through the various college football playoff controversies or close calls, the better TV draw has gotten the nod every time. Alabama over Ohio State in 2017, Notre Dame over Texas A&M in 2020. The TV draw wins, and that's another thing which has undermined the integrity of this process. And so that's part of the whole mix with those polls. Yes, they do have an influence because the media coverage gets funneled through a few certain narrow silos, and people latch onto those silos instead of just following the action, following the results where they lead organically each week. And that's why you get, you don't get the right thought process in terms of ranking teams properly at the beginning, in the middle, and sadly at the very end.
Matt, there are 3 directions I'd like to go based on what you just stated. One would be, I'm going to somewhat challenge your statement about the TV draw. Is Ohio State not a better TV draw than Alabama?
I think if you look at 2017 and just the dynamics involved there, remember that Ohio State got crushed by Clemson 31-0 in the Fiesta Bowl the year before. So there was definitely a belief that Alabama, you're getting a better game. And let's also remember that that was an Alabama-Clemson semifinal, the only time they've met in a semi. So Alabama-Clemson was going to bring more heft to a semifinal than Ohio State playing Clemson, because we had Ohio State Clemson the year before. So I really do think that ESPN was using that television-centric thought process in arranging that Alabama-Clemson matchup.
Point number two, and this is not necessarily a discussion for this show, but I would love to have Matt and I get together during the off season and really slice up college football history in some type of fashion. But going back to that 1983 season, not only is the narrative in line with everything that you pointed out, but consider that, number one, Auburn also played by far the most difficult schedule in the country. It was brutal. Their schedule was brutal that season. Number two, what I find interesting and also kind of amusing looking back on these scenarios during that time was these bowl games were almost treated as playoff games by the pollsters, meaning in that particular season, Texas finished 11-1 as well. They lost by 1 point in the Cotton Bowl to Georgia. They beat Auburn, but that Cotton Bowl was considered like, well, that's a playoff game, which in fact, they weren't playoff games. It was just an additional game played. It should have just been another metric. You know, I know that it would have seemed odd to crown a national champion that lost its bowl game, but in a sense, that bowl game was just another game, another metric.
I mean, and that back then, like that really is what it was, because there wasn't that one, in the current era and also in the BCS era, you had the standalone so-called national championship game. Now, there were only a select few times preceding the BCS era when there was a standalone title game. You had it a few times in the Bowl Alliance, Bowl Coalition era, like Nebraska, Florida in 1995. That was a standalone national championship game. But of course, the next year you didn't. Like, the Rose Bowl between Arizona State and Ohio State, that was one piece of the puzzle. And then the Sugar Bowl between Florida and Florida State, that was another piece. You often still had competing games in terms of the national championship. And so in prior eras, there were only a select few times, like 1986 Miami Penn State at the Fiesta Bowl at the end of that season. Usually, though, you had some mix of sugar, cotton, orange, and the results of those games. It was like another regular season Saturday. Yeah, like it was another data point in terms of arriving at your full body of work. It wasn't so much a national championship game. You're exactly right.
The other portion here, in looking at the AP and the coaches poll currently, and I find this interesting because, again, this becomes a common criticism to my top 25. So, for example, earlier this season, Oklahoma State was 3-0 and ranked number 7 in the AP poll with wins over Arizona State, Central Michigan, and giving up 44 points, and an FCS win. But since they were that highly ranked in the preseason, they maintained that. Now, how many seasons Oklahoma State, not being a blue blood, was either unranked in the preseason or 22nd in the preseason poll? And if they had defeated Arizona State, Central Michigan, and an FCS, they wouldn't have shot up to number 7 in the country. So here we are with TCU 7-0. They are number 7. They gained a spot this weekend. And I could certainly see a number of powers, a number of name brands in the sport had they defeated, let's say, Oklahoma, Kansas State, Kansas, and Oklahoma State would be higher than number 7 right now.
No question. And this really goes back to 2014, right? With TCU and Baylor. Let's just keep it this simple. TCU, we know this. TCU, Baylor, other non-helmet schools, they do not get treated in the Big 12 the same way that Texas and Oklahoma do get treated or would get treated in equivalent situations. In the SEC, Auburn does not get treated the same way that Alabama and Georgia do. There are obvious differences in terms of the way certain teams get treated within certain conferences based on their reputation. And this is Trojans wire. USC obviously will get the benefit of the doubt in ways that UCLA, Utah, and Oregon won't. I mean, and with Oregon's, in terms of, the Pac-12 in the playoff, just for a second here, the fact that Oregon lost by 46 to Georgia, like that's just so much of an albatross. I don't think that's ever something that the Ducks are going to be able to overcome, barring so many dominoes have to fall that it just has to be clear that Oregon has to be the 4th seed. But if there's any question or ambiguity, it's just really hard to see Oregon there. And then Utah already has 2 losses, so the Utes aren't even part of it. And if UCLA somehow gets to 12-1, wins out, that really, really soft, mushy non-conference schedule, like UCLA with 1 loss and that non-con slate, Alabama State, South Alabama, Bowling Green, sorry, you're not getting a 1-loss Pac-12 team in the playoff if it doesn't have a marquee non-conference win. So just by process of elimination, if you're looking at the one team in the Pac-12 that still has, at least a better than microscopic chance, it's USC. And that's not because USC has an amazing, profile, because the Trojans didn't win their big game against Utah, but you don't have the warts that Oregon, the Georgia loss, UCLA, soft non-conference schedule, Utah, 2 losses. USC just has the fewest warts of any of the 4 contenders left. So broader point being that helmet schools, elite schools get treated differently from the TCUs, the Syracuses. If Syracuse had beaten Clemson, Syracuse probably is not in the top 5, might be where TCU is at number 7, number 8. The schools get treated differently. And that's another thing that fans across the country see, and they recognize it's a joke. It's not fair. It's not a level playing field.
I always find this dynamic pretty interesting as well. And I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong, but it's obviously flawed. Syracuse was number 14 in the AP and the coaches poll. They went to Death Valley and played the number 5 team in the country and outplayed them for 3+ quarters, had the lead, lost a 6-point game that was, again, there were some questionable calls in that game. So isn't that what the number 14 team in the country reasonably should do, playing at the number 5 team in the country, lose a close game? Isn't that actually to Syracuse's credit that they played that well, but then they dropped in the rankings?
Absolutely. That should definitely be a place holding, place maintaining kind of result. And of course, it just doesn't work that way. Certainly not for the Syracuses of the world. Now, if we're talking about, if Alabama had lost that kind of game to number 5 Clemson, yeah, you might just see the Tide drop 1 or 2 spots. But yeah, teams are not treated the same. And
as opposed to a 14th ranked Syracuse team that went out and beat, if they beat Louisville and they beat them by a touchdown, and a few teams had lost, and whatever the pecking order was, they could have moved up for having a much less outstanding performance than the one that they showed us on Saturday.
Absolutely. And it brings up a larger point that we need to start fresh, right? You start fresh in your whole evaluation of everybody each week. Because Georgia's been number 1, that doesn't mean Georgia has an automatic right to number 1. Georgia has to actually beat teams. Now, of course, again, this is the thing that people forget about rankings, is that you're going to have your chances later in the season to affirm your ranking. So what if you're ranked 9 right now and not 5? So what if you're ranked 7 and not 3? If you have big games down the line, you'll move up. That'll take care of itself. Why people get so bent out of shape that the rankings right now are not where you want them to be. You just win your games and it'll resolve itself. That's really hilarious, because nothing's being decided in college football. Nothing ever has been decided based on where you're ranked on October 24. It's where you're ranked at the end. All right. End of the regular season, end of conference championship Saturday in the playoff era. And then of course, at the end of the whole season. So that's what matters. It's not where you're ranked right now. You have 5-6 games left to play. take care of business. It'll all resolve itself. And obviously, if we want to have a firefight, if we want to have a 15-round heavyweight bout, well, that's what Thanksgiving weekend's for. Like, that's when we get into the nitty-gritty of, having the whole season resume, and we better make sure that this team is ranked ahead of that team so that it gets the right bowl bid, it gets the playoff berth, et cetera, et cetera. That's a month away. We don't need to have that debate right now. We don't need to have that debate every week. And so resetting completely fresh every week, that leads to a process that has integrity. It's a college football top 25 that makes sense. But Mark, it's also a college football top 25 that is fair to everyone. We also need to make that point.
Yes, and to the point I make to Ohio State fans who are basically they just can't forgive me for ranking Ohio State behind Michigan. How could I dare do that when most likely the two best Big Ten teams on their schedules are Penn State and Maryland? Well, Michigan has already played Penn State and Maryland in one of those games impressively. Ohio State has yet to play Penn State and Maryland. Hey, folks. Ohio State's playing Penn State this week.
This week, yeah. It'll take care of itself. It'll take care of itself. That's all we need to say here.
It's an interesting process. I love these comments by D. D, I would love if he would call one of the call-in shows. I would just love to talk to you directly. I am not going to jump on you in any way, but for some reason, D has been on this narrative the entire season that I'm just in love with Utah. I don't understand this. I predicted Utah to go, Matt, 7-2 in the Pac-12 and 10-2 over. Is that like out of line with what most people projected Utah to do this year?
If you projected Utah to go 10-2, you were not overhyping Utah. You were underselling Utah, because I think the line on USC, like, I followed the projections on USC very closely. The national consensus, bloggers, websites, publications, pundits, the consensus on USC was 9-3. My understanding, my read of the national consensus on Utah was 11-1. 11-1 is where I think most people saw Utah landing at the end of the season, because most people thought that Utah would beat Florida. There are plenty of people who thought Florida would beat Utah, but most people had Utah winning that game over Florida and going 11-1 in the 12-game schedule. So anyone who said that Utah was going to lose twice was generally going below, not above, the national consensus on the Utes. You could say that 10-2 was the consensus. It was either 10-2 or 11-1. So 10-2, you're still on the low end of the consensus. Maybe not under the consensus, but certainly low end of the consensus. So, like, definitely not overselling Utah. If you had Utah winning 12 games, you were probably overselling Utah, but not 10. Like, there's no way to make that claim, D, as much as you might protest to the contrary.
Yeah, I would just like to understand what the gripe is. I just don't understand this exact narrative has been going on with D for like ever since the season started. I picked UCLA as well to go 10-2, 7-2 in the Pac-12. So I don't know.
And both those predictions are looking pretty darn good right now, if I might say so.
We get some right, we get some wrong.
I would say that I certainly hope USC finishes 10-2, because if that's the case, that means USC is probably 11-1.
All right. Anything else here that we would like to get covered tonight?
Well, we have someone saying, Duke crushed Miami. Wow, Mario Cristobal just bottoming out, and it's fascinating to see Cristobal crashing and burning while Dan Lanning is just kicking it at Oregon. And that brings up a point. That onside kick for Lanning in Oregon against UCLA, that was a stroke of genius, because the game started slowly, but at the time that onside kick was made, you saw both offenses were beginning to dominate. They were both getting into a rhythm. And so, I always go back to the Baker Mayfield Patrick Mahomes game, 66-59, Oklahoma Texas Tech, when you know that you're not likely to stop the opponent onside kick, right? Because why have the opponent drive 80 yards for touchdown when it can just be 45? Your defense is not on the field as long, so it stays comparatively fresher. You get the ball back sooner. The risk reward is a little bit different when you sense that a game is just going to go completely into video game mode. Why not onside kick? Why not see if you can steal a possession? And of course, it's a surprise onside kick. It's not an end game onside kick. So the other team's not expecting it. If you know you have a good onside kick plan, and like the up men are not focused, like when you see those up men drifting away on film, you know that you have an opening to do that. Like that was the exact right time to pull the trigger on that. So even if UCLA had recovered it, I still would have admired the move. Dan Lanning was great in game management. He always went for it on fourth downs. Cristobal probably punts on at least a few of those. I think there was Oregon had a 4th and 5 at the UCLA 38. Cristobal probably punts in that situation. So seeing Cristobal have his struggles at Miami, it's a real contrast with what Dan Lanning and Kenny Dillingham have done at Oregon. And hey, I was wrong about Bo Nix. I said that at the beginning of the show. I've been proved wrong by Kenny Dillingham. I was not high on that offensive coordinator hire. I thought that was going to be a real advantage for Oregon opponents. Nope. Kenny Dillingham is getting the most out of Bo Nix. I would say that the fact that they worked together at Auburn, so they had a prior working relationship, that's really paying dividends, and that's an overlooked factor in terms of the Oregon offense coming together this season.
I posted a video earlier today on the Miami channel just looking at this rough start for Mario Cristobal at Miami and Miami's run of bad hires. And I kind of give a concession to Mark Richt for certain reasons. But other than that, when you really look at the Miami hires, Matt, post Butch Davis, they have one thing in common. None of them succeeded as Power 5 coaches before Miami. None of them succeeded as Power 5 coaches after Miami, which proves to me that they were all bad hires.
Well, so with Cristobal, I mean, this is a complicated discussion along those lines.
Taking Cristobal out of, I'm sorry, prior to Cristobal,
okay.
Obviously he succeeded at Oregon. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Sure. And that's very true. That you need someone who's walked through the fire. Like that applies to Marcus Freeman at Notre Dame. Like that's why I think Notre Dame really needed to choose Luke Fickell instead of Marcus Freeman. Like your first head coaching job is Notre Dame. Now, obviously, Lincoln Riley, his first head coaching job was at Oklahoma. So, but Oklahoma, like this makes Oklahoma special within college football history. Oklahoma has been uniquely successful at finding the young coach without prior head coaching experience who's able to just crush it right away. Bud Wilkinson, Barry Switzer, Bob Stoops, Lincoln Riley, all hired before 40 years old as their first head coaching job. They all, were tremendously successful, but that's the exception to the rule. And so Notre Dame getting a guy who had not been head coach before, and you walk into that Notre Dame fishbowl, I was uneasy about that, and I thought that the Irish really needed to make a play for Luke Fickell. I understand that Marcus Freeman's recruiting was through the roof, and that the players loved him. We're going to run through a brick wall for him. So it's really understandable why they made that move. So I'm not going to dump on it too much, but Notre Dame has needed coaches with prior head coaching experience, like Ara Parseghian at Northwestern before he took the Notre Dame job. Dan Devine won a national championship at Notre Dame. He had the experiences at Missouri and Arizona State. Lou Holtz, Arkansas. The coaches that generally nailed it at Notre Dame, they had a prior run as a head coach, which really seasoned them and prepared them. Notre Dame, Frank Leahy, he coached at Boston College before World War II, before he took over Notre Dame and was arguably a better coach than Knute Rockne for the Fighting Irish. So like there's a real trend at Notre Dame where the great coaches had prior head coaching experience. You didn't have that with Marcus Freeman. So like in comparison to Miami, that's what makes Cristobal's struggles this year so surprising, because he did win a Rose Bowl at Oregon. Like, he did build that program. He left Dan Lanning with an offensive line that's just road grading, kicked UCLA's butt. So, like, there's definitely some talent and some quality there in terms of Cristobal. But obviously what we're seeing is, and we saw this with Justin Herbert, we saw this with Anthony Brown, he limits quarterbacks. Like, he does not allow quarterbacks to shine. He does not allow quarterbacks to develop. He doesn't understand what is the secret sauce that puts quarterbacks in position to be at their best. So, like, we're now dealing with a third failure on the part of Cristobal to maximize his quarterback talent. Herbert, Anthony Brown, and now Tyler Van Dyke at Miami.
And Matt, I've always considered, if you want to put the role of a head coach into 3 buckets, it would be, for me, talent acquisition, meaning high school recruiting and now the transfer portal. And then bucket B would be culture, organization, building your program, your communication with players, how you coach your coaching staff, acquire your coaching staff, lead the organization as a CEO. And then number 3 would be schemes, offense and defense, game preparation, ability to manage a game, time management, in-game adjustments, everything dealing with game day. And Mario Cristobal's a tremendous recruiter.
Yeah, he checks that box.
The second box, I don't know if he checks it or not. I see pluses and minuses there. I see some strong leadership, but I also see some issues there. And then point number 3, not a good game coach. Just,
yep.
Put him in the less minus bucket right now.
Yeah, no question. That's exactly right.
I only want to make one other point and get your thought here. Obviously, National Signing Day is coming up mid-December. We're sitting here about 6 to 7 weeks in front of that. It's a crucial time for a lot of programs around the nation. But my thought concerning USC is that, of course, it's important, but they're pretty much playing with house money at this point. And they're really in a situation where they've overplayed themselves at this point, coming off 4-8. Lincoln Riley, the shine is still there, of course. That really, it's going to be difficult for them to lose anything in the recruiting game. They have set themselves up nicely to finish strong for National Signing Day.
I think the one thing that USC would really love to get out of National Signing Day is a 5-star offensive lineman, because that's been the thing that USC has not been able to get for several years. If USC, they've gotten some 4 stars, can they land the really big fish on the offensive line? That's been like the holy grail for USC in recent years, trying to get that. If the Trojans can get that, like, that would be a crown jewel type moment. Now, having said that, in terms of the transfer portal, like, Lincoln Riley has shown that he can work the portal. It's one of his best assets as a coach off the field in terms of that talent acquisition bucket that you just mentioned. He's going to continue to raid the portal, and man, he's going to have a banquet table available in the portal, because you look at the disintegrating situation at Louisville, you look at the disintegrating situation for Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M, and of course, Josh Henson, the offensive line coach, used to be at Texas A&M. Lincoln Riley's coaching staff has a lot of Texas roots, and you have other problematic situations across the country, maybe Sark and Texas as well, where you could see a lot of players saying, you know what, I'm stuck here. I need to get out of here. I need to find a new place to play. Man, I can see USC and Lincoln Riley being very active and very successful at raiding the portal, pouncing on those vulnerable situations at Texas A&M, at Louisville. I mentioned Louisville because Louisville did a lot in the NIL space. Louisville threw a lot of dollars in the NIL space at recruits. And so assuming Scott Satterfield gets fired and he's squarely on the hot seat, I don't think the win over Pitt changes things too much, though it obviously helps. But, assuming that Satterfield gets fired, Louisville is going to be a prime place for Lincoln Riley to jump in the transfer portal. So even if the recruiting doesn't hit all the boxes and hit all the marks, there's going to be a banquet table in the transfer portal for Lincoln Riley at USC.
USC Trojans live here every Monday at 11 Eastern. That's 8 Pacific where it counts. With Matt Zemek from Trojans Wire. Please check out his work on Trojans Wire as USC gets set for the stretch drive of the Pac-12, starting with Arizona coming up on the road this Saturday night. And also we'll have USC post-game right here at the Voice of College Football with Tony, Tim, and Rick. And our next show is Iowa Live coming up Tuesday on the Iowa channel at 5:30 Eastern, 4:30 Central. Matt, closing bid right here. Anything else for us?
Just want to remind you that Utah, Washington State Thursday night. So we're going to cover that game, and obviously at Trojans Wire, we're certainly pulling for the Cougars because that would then mean for sure that USC controls its destiny in the race for a spot in the Pac-12 championship game. So Utah, Washington State coverage during the middle of the week, and then of course full Arizona game coverage Saturday night, and it's the last Pac-12 network game of the year. So that's always cause for celebration. In November, it's going to be all prime network slots. So like we're going to get over the hump with this Arizona game. After this one, it's preferred TV slots for the rest of the season. So that's a cause for joy here at Trojans Wire.
Folks, if you enjoyed the conversation here with Matt, please support us by hitting the like button. Also getting back here next Tuesday night at 8 o'clock Pacific time, and bring some friends with you to talk college football with us each and every Tuesday, each and every Monday. Some habits are hard to break. Each and every Monday, everyone, 8 o'clock Pacific time.
And of course, it's Tuesday at 12:14 a.m. Where you are. So like you're speaking on a Tuesday now. So
I'll take it, Matt. Anytime you can cover up my mistakes, I will take it. Matt, we always appreciate it. Great job as always. Appreciate you being here. Have a great week. Enjoy the football this weekend.
Thank you, Mark. We always love the support you give us here at the Voice of College Football.